The judge raised his gavel, ready to destroy an innocent man's life. Then the courtroom doors swung open, every head turned, and standing in the doorway with fire in his eyes was Harrison Ford. The entire room fell silent. No one knew why he was there, but what happened next would change everything. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe. It helps a lot and keeps stories like this coming. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? The courtroom air was thick with quiet dread. Jake Holloway, a 26-year-old mechanic, sat rigid in his chair, his fingers clenched into fists beneath the table. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the wooden benches packed with silent spectators. His mother sat in the front row, eyes red, hands gripping a crumpled tissue. Everyone in the room could feel it. The trial wasn't about truth. It was about power. Behind the towering judge's bench, Judge Clarence Holt adjusted his robes with a smirk. His reputation preceded him, a man who turned justice into a business, taking bribes from the wealthy while crushing those without connections. Today was no different. The case against Jake was a flimsy stack of circumstantial evidence, easily dismantled, if only the judge had allowed it. But every time Jake's defense attorney tried, Holt's gavel struck like a hammer on steel. Motion denied. Irrelevant. Move on, came his repeated, dismissive responses. Jake's lawyer, Peter Calloway, stood once again, his voice strained yet determined. Your Honor, my client has an alibi. Surveillance footage proves he was at his garage during the robbery. We've submitted this evidence twice, yet the prosecution refuses to acknowledge. That's enough, Mr. Calloway. Holt's voice boomed, dripping with finality. He leaned forward, fingers laced together, the smirk never leaving his face. The jury has heard the evidence. There's no need to drag this out. We will proceed with sentencing. Jake felt his breath hitch. This was it. The truth didn't matter. The system had failed him. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. This couldn't be happening. His entire life, his garage, his dreams, his freedom was slipping through his fingers, and he was powerless to stop it. He turned to his lawyer, desperate for a last-minute miracle, but Calloway only gave a slow, defeated shake of his head. The jury members avoided his eyes, already resigned to the outcome. The system wasn't built to save people like him. A muffled sob broke the silence. His mother. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. He's innocent. She clutched her chest like she was physically holding in her heartbreak. Judge Holt didn't even spare her a glance. Instead, he raised his gavel, ready to seal Jake's fate. The room seemed to shrink, every sound muffled, every second stretching endlessly. Then, bang! The heavy courtroom doors swung open, slamming against the walls with a force that sent gasps rippling through the room. Every head turned, and standing in the doorway, backlit by the hallway lights, was a man they all recognized instantly. Harrison Ford. He wasn't in a tailored suit, wasn't there for a press event. He stood there in a worn leather jacket, a steely fire in his eyes, his jaw clenched tight. And when he spoke, his voice cut through the silence like a knife. You and I need to talk, Holt. For a moment, the entire courtroom froze. Gasps, murmurs, shocked whispers. The bailiff took a hesitant step forward, unsure whether to intervene. The jury gawked, eyes darting between the Hollywood legend and the judge, who had suddenly gone rigid. Even the prosecutor, who had been smugly awaiting Jake's conviction, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Holt cleared his throat, but his voice lacked its usual arrogance. Mr. Ford, he said, forcing a tight smile, this is highly inappropriate. I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is a court of law. I know exactly what this is. Ford cut him off. His voice was low, measured, but dangerous. He took another step forward, his presence suffocating the room with intensity. And I know exactly who you are, Holt. His eyes flicked to Jake, then back to the judge. I also know that you're about to send an innocent man to prison, and I won't let that happen. Jake blinked in confusion, his breath shallow. Why was Harrison Ford here? Why did he care? But then Ford turned to him, his expression softening for just a moment. "Hang in there, kid," he said. Then he faced the judge once more. "Because I'm about to put an end to this." Holt's smirk was gone. His fingers curled around the edge of his bench, knuckles white. "Bailiff," he snapped, his voice tight, "escort Mr. Ford out of my courtroom." But no one moved. Not the bailiff, not the jury, not even the prosecutor. Everyone was waiting because they wanted to hear what Ford had to say. Ford let the silence stretch, his gaze locked onto the judge's. Then, with deliberate calm, he said, "Jake Holloway is my godson." A fresh wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Jake's eyes widened, his mother's hand flying to her mouth. Ford continued, his voice steady. "I made a promise to his father before he died that I'd look after him, and I'll be damned if I let a corrupt judge throw him away like trash." Judge Holt flinched. It was quick, but Ford saw it. The fear, the recognition. "I don't care who you are," Holt spat, trying to mask his unease. "This case is closed." He reached for his gavel, but Ford took a step closer, his next words slicing through the air like a blade. "No, Holt, this case isn't closed, because I know what you did." Judge Holt's fingers hovered over the gavel, but he didn't bring it down. His breath hitched, just for a second. The courtroom felt like it had shrunk, every eye locked on the two men facing off. Ford stood tall, unwavering, while the judge who had ruled over this room like a king suddenly looked small. Ford took a slow step forward. "I know about Mason Carter." The color drained from Holt's face. A visible tremor ran through his fingers. The name meant nothing to the jury, nothing to the reporters or the spectators, but it meant something to him. He swallowed hard. You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice no longer carrying its usual authority. Ford's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. "Don't I?" He tilted his head, watching Holt squirm. "You sent the wrong man to prison once before, didn't you?" Mason Carter. Framed him for a crime he didn't commit. Took a fat paycheck to make sure the evidence never saw daylight. And then he... Ford's jaw clenched. He died behind bars. A shocked murmur rippled through the room. Jake's lawyer turned to Holt, eyes wide. The courtroom had stopped being about Jake's trial. Now it was about Holt's past. Judge Holt's lips parted, but no words came out. The confident, untouchable man who had controlled the fate of so many suddenly looked like a caged animal. The courtroom, once suffocated by his authority, now pulsed with whispers of doubt and suspicion. For the first time, people were seeing the cracks. Holt started, but his voice wavered. His eyes darted to the bailiff, to the prosecutor, to the jury, searching for an ally, a lifeline, but he found none. The courtroom wasn't his kingdom anymore. It belonged to Ford. Ford folded his arms, waiting. He didn't need to say more. The weight of the truth was already suffocating Holt. But then a voice broke the silence. "He's right." The room gasped as an older man in the audience stood up. He had sharp, tired eyes and a face lined with regret. He pointed a steady finger at Holt. "I was there. I helped bury the evidence in the Mason Carter case, and I'm not staying quiet anymore." Judge Holt's breath came fast and shallow. His mask was slipping. "This is outrageous," he barked, his voice cracking as he pointed at the man who had just stood. "You're a liar." "I have proof," the man interrupted, his voice firm. He pulled a worn folder from inside his coat and held it up. "The night Mason Carter was sentenced, I was ordered to destroy key evidence. I didn't. I kept copies. And these papers," his grip tightened, "they show you took bribes to bury the truth." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their notepads. Jury members whispered furiously. Even the prosecutor looked rattled. Holt's eyes flicked around, wild and desperate. "This is a setup," he spat. "A damn conspiracy." Ford stepped closer, his expression like carved stone. "No, Holt, this is justice." His voice dropped to a near growl. You didn't just frame Mason Carter, you ruined his life, and you want to know why I care?" His fists clenched. "Because Mason was my friend." Ford's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The room was silent. No more whispers, no more gasps. Just the weight of his revelation pressing down on everyone. Mason Carter wasn't just another victim of Holt's corruption. He had meant something to Ford. Holt's face twisted with frustration. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice teetering between anger and fear. He turned to the bailiff, to the court clerk, to anyone who would listen. "Are you really going to let some washed-up actor take over my courtroom?" Ford didn't flinch. He stepped closer, voice calm, but razor-sharp. "Mason Carter was a good man. He had a family, dreams. You stole that from him." He took another step, his gaze never wavering. "And now? You're trying to do the same thing to Jake." The jury shifted in their seats. Their faces, once neutral, were now filled with doubt. The weight of Holt's authority was crumbling. And then one of them, an older woman in the front row, lifted her hand. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I request that this trial be paused until we hear the evidence against you." Holt's jaw clenched so hard the veins in his neck bulged. His control over the courtroom was slipping through his fingers. He slammed his gavel down, his voice shaking. "This is my courtroom. I will not be interrogated like some common criminal." But the jury wasn't looking at him the same way anymore. The older woman who had spoken, juror number 6, folded her arms. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said, "if you're guilty of burying evidence, then we have no reason to trust your rulings." A few other jurors nodded in agreement. Ford let the moment hang in the air before striking again. "This isn't just about Mason Carter," he said, voice calm but piercing. "How many others, Holt? How many lives have you destroyed?" He turned, sweeping his gaze across the room. "How many innocent people sat in that chair just like Jake, while this man sold their futures to the highest bidder?" Jake felt something shift inside him. For the first time since his arrest, hope flickered. This wasn't just his fight anymore. The entire courtroom was waking up, and Judge Holt was running out of places to hide. Holt's breathing turned shallow. He could feel control slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Enough of this nonsense," he roared, slamming his gavel down so hard that it cracked the wood. "This trial is over. The jury will disregard this circus act and focus on the case at hand." But no one was listening. The jury exchanged glances, their doubt growing into something more dangerous, outright defiance. The prosecutor, who had been so eager to push for Jake's conviction, suddenly shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "given these new allegations, perhaps we should—" "No!" Holt's voice cracked. His skin was clammy, his hands trembling. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had run this courtroom like a king for years, bending the law to his will, making problems disappear. But now the problem was him. Then a sharp rustling of paper cut through the air. The old witness who had stood earlier, the man who had confessed to hiding evidence, held up another sealed envelope, his eyes locked onto Ford. "There's more," he said, "and this will end him for good." Holt's face twitched as the witness stepped forward, envelope in hand. The room was dead silent, as if the very air had been sucked out. Every eye was locked on the trembling document. Whatever was inside had the power to end everything. The prosecutor leaned forward, suddenly looking interested. "What is that?" he asked, his voice wary. The witness cleared his throat. "Bank records," he said. "Proof that Judge Holt accepted over $2 million in bribes to fix trials, including Jake's." A collective gasp erupted in the room. Jake felt his stomach twist. This was bigger than he had imagined. Holt shot to his feet, his chair screeching against the floor. His face was flushed red with panic, sweat dripping down his temple. "This is a lie," he bellowed. "I won't stand for this slander. This is my courtroom." His fingers twitched toward his gavel, but this time the bailiff stepped forward. The bailiff's heavy boots thudded against the wooden floor as he stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm but unreadable. "I need you to step down." Holt's head snapped toward him, disbelief flashing in his wild eyes. "What?" he barked. "You work for me. I am the law in this room." His hands trembled as he gripped the bench, his knuckles bone white, but no one was on his side anymore. The prosecutor stood up, smoothing his tie, eyes wary but resigned. "Given the allegations," he said slowly, "I formally request that this case be postponed pending an investigation into Judge Holt's conduct." Popab. A roar of agreement rippled through the crowd. Holt's mouth opened and closed, his final grasp on power slipping like sand through his fingers. His whole body shook with rage and desperation, but it was over. The walls were closing in. Holt's chest heaved, his once commanding presence reduced to a desperate, cornered man. His fingers twitched near his gavel, but no one cared. The jury, the spectators, even the court officers, they were done listening to him. "I will not step down," Holt bellowed, slamming his fist onto the bench. "I built this courtroom. His words broke off as the bailiff placed a firm hand on his shoulder. The unthinkable had happened. Ford exhaled slowly, stepping beside Jake's table. His voice was low, final. "You built this courtroom on fear, Holt." His eyes narrowed. "But today, fear isn't enough to save you." Holt jerked away from the bailiff, his eyes wild, but no one was coming to his rescue. The weight of his crimes had finally collapsed in on him, and as the seconds dragged on, it became painfully clear he had lost. Holt's breath came in ragged bursts. His eyes darted across the courtroom, searching for an escape, for an ally, for anything that could save him. But all he saw were faces filled with disgust, betrayal, and something he had never feared before, justice. And then he snapped. With a sudden frantic movement, he reached for his gavel and hurled it across the room, sending it clattering against the marble floor. "You're all fools!" he bellowed. "Do you think this changes anything? I have friends in high places. You'll regret this." But no one flinched. Instead, the bailiff clamped a hand down on Holt's arm, his grip unshakable. The judge jerked and thrashed, but there was nowhere left to run. "Clarence Holt," the bailiff said, voice steady, "you're under investigation for judicial misconduct and corruption. You'll be escorted from this courtroom immediately." A deafening silence followed. Then, as Holt was dragged from the bench, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Justice was served, but how many more innocent people suffer under corrupt systems like this? If you loved this epic showdown of truth versus power, share this story with someone who loves a heroic, against-all-odds fight for justice. And if you want more thrilling stories like this, stick around, because we're just getting started.